Well, welcome to the Pod of the Gaps. It's very exciting to be able to actually welcome you to a podcast that now has a name. Although we have been thinking that maybe the podcast will now be about 10 minutes shorter than normal because we won't be able to spend the first 10 minutes discussing what it should be called. But thank you for your feedback and hope that you now enjoy having a podcast that does have a name, whether you like the name or not. But I'm joined, as normal, by Andy Bannister and Aaron Edwards, and I'm Michael Otts, and this is the podcast where we basically get to discuss topical issues of a blend of theology and apologetics and banter. And today we're going to be thinking about the question, should Christians quit social media? And this really kind of came to our attention as a couple of us had been watching the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which raised quite a few issues from a kind of secular standpoint, at least, about some of the distractions and the dangers of social media. And certainly as Christians, it's worth thinking those things through and thinking about how we respond to that. Should we quit? Should we try and think about how we use it differently? Do we need to be more aware of some of the dangers? These are all kind of questions we want to think about. And particularly for those who are in positions of Christian leadership, what are the ways in which we can use social media, but maybe some of the dangers we need to be aware of. So as we look at this, one of the things that really struck me from the Social Dilemma was this sense of the fact that we are basically, our attention is the thing that is being marketed. So the whole design of social media is to basically keep your attention for as long as possible. That's the way that it's designed to work. I think there was a line in the documentary where they said basically the only two businesses, inverted commas, in the world that talk about their customers as users are social media companies and the illegal drugs trade. So in a sense, we are the user. We are the ones being used. It's our attention that is the product in that sense. So I guess what are some of the dangers that we've seen in this, particularly, I guess, thinking about distraction? Andy, Aaron, how have you found, you're both on social media, both active in it. How have you found that in your own experience kind of coming to play, and how have you managed to deal with that? Or do you manage to deal with that? What are some of the things that you're aware of?
Yeah. Well, happy to have a go at that first, and then Aaron kind of chip in. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I think, like you, Michael, I remember watching The Social Dilemma, watched it with my wife, and I think afterwards we turned to each other and went, oh my word, we've got to make some changes. But in one sense, it exposed things, I think, that had already been there. And in fact, the book that really opened my eyes to this was a bit early in The Social Dilemma, and it was Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows, that dates way back now. I forget when that first came out.
2010, I think it was.
I was going to say, look at I've got a copy of my desk, was leafing through it. 2010, I think. And actually predating that was an article Nick wrote for the Atlantic magazine called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And I think distraction is the big part of that story. And there was a piece of that book, and then the article that preceded it, where he talked about just that sense he'd begun to notice in himself through heavy, both internet use, but also social media use, where he was just finding it harder to read long pieces of copy, be the articles or books and so forth. And I remember reading it going, Struth, that is absolutely my world, because as someone who loves reading, I'm a massive reader, I read all the time. But I've noticed that in recent years, really struggling. It takes harder to get the concentration and so forth. And I've really begun to appreciate, I think that social media has been a big part of that, because you're used to constantly scrolling and clicking. Or sometimes catch myself refreshing the Facebook page if anything new has happened. And equally at the same time, when I force myself to step away from screens for a bit, the difference it makes. So I think distraction is a very much a big piece of the equation. There's other ones as well. And I think one of the mistakes that we can make, and I think I've certainly kind of made, so I'm not picking on others, but because I see this in myself, right, is that I think we assume that our attention is just something that we can divide up infinitesimally into smaller and smaller units and not cause any issues. And there are certainly some things you can divide up into smaller and smaller amounts. I mean, if you take a glass, take a glass of water, you can drink it in one big gulp, you can drink it in lots of sips. Doesn't make much difference. Either way it's going in probably has rather the same effect. There are other things that you can't divide up into smaller and smaller things without diminishing them. And I think our time and our attention is one of those things, whether it's an attention on a piece of reading or there's attention on relationships, whether we're playing with our children or spending time with our loved ones. So yeah, I think we do live in a world that wants us to divide our attention largely for profit in the case of the social media companies. And I think therefore we need to ask some tough questions. And certainly one response is the question we sort of cheekily titled this show with: should we quit our social media accounts entirely? We can explore that obviously a bit more over the next half an hour or so. But yeah, distraction is the big thing, I think. Aaron, what about you? What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I'm still just trying to cope with the fact that we've gone straight into a topic. We've just we've not talked about our name at all. I can't believe it. I feel like it's 5
We
minutes
have distracted ourselves, have we? We have distracted people.
What's social media doing to us that we're not? Yeah, we're just talking about content straight away as if that's more important. I can't believe it. Anyway, but no, I totally resonate with all of that. I think Carr's the Swallows book is really, really good. It's one that I'm using on a course that I've designed at Cliff College on the impact of digitization on preaching, particularly in relation to, what does preaching look like, or should look like, or how has social media or digitization in general affected how people expect communication to happen? And that there's loads of really bad things that can happen off the back of it. And it doesn't mean that preaching should then go, oh, right, what should we do to help this situation? Because actually we really need as the church to take a stronger line to stop the malformation of minds, which is happening as a result of our total embeddedness in digital media. So for myself, it's funny you mentioned, Andy, the thing about brain use. I just, as you said that, I had this really weird memory of being an undergraduate student when my housemates and I used to play this game called on the Nintendo DS. Do you remember them? They were like these little, it was pre-iPhone, and you had a little stylus to do a game. And the only game I had on it, I got it bought for me or given to me or something. As a kind of, I almost brought it back to uni as a kind of joke. And we all just got hooked on this game called Dr. Kawashima's Brain Training. It was the only game that was there. We got into kind of quite competitive, and it showed you every now and then. It gave you a little tutorial of a brain map of how much heat is on your brain when you're doing certain activities. And this is what it's like when you're watching TV and there's hardly anything going on. And then here's what it's like when you're doing a crossword and it's like all over the map there's heat happening. And even there I was thinking, oh gosh, that was almost, we didn't pay much attention at first to that. But then as social media developed further, of course, Facebook 2004, iPhone is it 2007, changing the face of how you interact. I'm starting to see that the real difference, that what we give our time to and what we give our attention to actually gives a lot of attention to us and changes the way we can attend to others. I can remember sitting in coffee shops with people not long after the advent of the iPhone, where people are happy to just text as they're talking to you. I know it's almost like we've become used to that now, but I remember being really, really shocked, just thinking, how do you think this is an okay thing for you to do? I'm the only one here and I can see you doing it. But it's apparently totally okay to do this. I don't understand why. So for me, though I'm happy to be connected, I used to have an iPhone, then it got viced accidentally in a cinema chair once. And since that point, which I'll explain more about another time. I did take it back to the Apple shop and they were just like, what do you expect us to do with this? I was like, well, come on, this is your phone. It literally looks like a banana. It had been completely viced. But since that point, someone gave me a rubbish phone, a kind of a dumb phone. And I was just going to tide me over for a few months or something until I got back on the smartphone trail. And I just found I really enjoyed being able to not being on the internet and being able to just call and text like the good old days. And it was interesting because it did change a lot. I was happier in doing so, and a lot of people say the same thing when they switch their kind of media habits. So for myself and my family, we're very tough line on smartphones. Really, it's not that we would completely say it's a terrible thing or outlaw it entirely, but I'm pretty sure we're not going to have them indefinitely, because I just think that the cost is too much. You can still go on the internet. I still enjoy choosing to go online rather than having to be connected online, because I just know I won't be able to stop, and I see the impact on everyone else and how it affects them. So there's that element of it. I mean, there's lots more I could say. I probably miss out not being connected to things like WhatsApp. I can't talk to you guys on WhatsApp. I'm sure you talk about me all the time in our
We're
podcast
basically chatting
WhatsApp.
about you all the time, and then every day you kind of come in and catch up on the conversation. So.
Exactly. That's why I like doing this podcast. I can catch up on what you guys have been talking about. But that's something there's missional things that you miss out on. When other people are connected to Twitter immediately and instantly, I can't do that. I've got to go onto my laptop or iPad, whatever, separately. So I think there's obviously pros. I don't think withdrawing entirely is a thing. And in many ways, I think I could probably do with pushing out a little bit more. But I think in general, I found the benefits of being less connected have been far more significant than, possible advantages on the other side.
Just one thing I wanted to pick up very quickly on there, and then back to you, Michael. You mentioned the digitization piece, Aaron, at the top of there. And one thing I remember that occurred to me, when the social media kind of revolution was kind of beginning, and I've got a sort of background in computer science before, got into all the stuff I'm in now. So you think about tech for a long time and love technology, always played with it, and so on and so forth, was the fact that I think one of the things that is sometimes missed is that digitization has a flattening effect. So when you digitize something, you flatten it. So the obvious example that's often used is, the difference between, say, a vinyl record, which is an analog version of the recording. So when you record something on vinyl, literally the orchestra, the singer does his or her thing, and that causes sound waves, which causes the needle to vibrate, and that sound wave is literally sort of effectively carved into the vinyl. So it's a one-for-one reproduction. But when we digitize a song, you can't digitize everything. So there's bits of the sound wave that aren't captured. And that's not a problem, because we can digitize at such high quality that we miss something's not a problem. But then we come to other things. I know Michael and I are kind of big outdoor people, right? So if you take a photograph of a beautiful view on a walk, that maybe it's a very high resolution photograph, looks good on your wallpaper on your computer, but you don't get the warmth of the sun on your skin. You don't get the sound of the river or the wind. You don't get the kind of ache in your muscles from climbing the mountain. It's been flattened. And then we come to social media that has that flattening effect with relationships. And you take someone like, say, Facebook, for example. Other social media platforms are available. And I remember early on in the social media craze, hearing people say, "Oh yeah, I've got 1,000 friends on Facebook." Yeah, hey. Well, if you think about it for a moment, you can only have 1,000 friends if you first flatten what it means to be a friend. And that's what Facebook has done. It's flattened human interaction to, I've clicked a like button, or I've clicked the invite button and they've responded. Whereas real world friendship has a lot more complexities, and real world communication has a lot more complexities. But I think when we digitize things, to say we flatten them, we simplify them, and sometimes the things that are chopped off are things that are actually important. And I wonder, this certainly goes for us as Christians, that we believe that communication is not just the exchange of information, but actually we are body, soul, and spirit, and not all of that can be captured in a digital interaction.
It's amazing, isn't it, when you think about how much the danger can be in us thinking we've had the real experience. So that's because when the digital offers us a digital version of an experience, we can actually then be duped into thinking that we've actually had that experience, but we haven't. And that's even more dangerous. Again, I remember when the iPhone first came out and someone was showing me a picture of an image of a candle where you could turn the iPhone and see the candle move like a real fire. And I was like, yeah, that's great. Like, you could use a real fire though. I mean, it does that as well. Reality does that too, but it's always exciting. We can replicate reality, but and it's almost the kind of excitement of it. But then we don't realize, as you say, Andy, you don't realize when real concepts in our mind are changing. Like, what is friendship changes. What does it mean to like something changes, doesn't it? I think I remember the person who invented the like, emoji, or what do you call it? Not an emoji, I guess a button. And she didn't have any idea the kind of impact that would have on the world in a big way. And there used to be an unlike button, didn't there? And they took that away. Is that right? Does anyone remember that? I feel like I remember.
I think you could still do that, of course, although the fun thing was about the like button. You're absolutely right. I think, and that comes out in the social dilemma, actually, of the inventor of it, talking about the fact that they had no idea this would then create this hamster wheel thing where people would do all kinds of tricks and things to get likes, or that you'd have teenagers self-harming or committing suicide because they didn't get enough likes, and this great monster. And then the other thing, of course, that was funny a few years ago, if you remember, there used to just be the like button, but then they realized that, somebody shares on social media that their father's just died, Well, is hitting like the appropriate response?
Yeah.
So Facebook tried to nuance it. So now I think there's 6 different emotions, right? You've got the 6 little, the smiley face, the grumpy face, the angry face, or the slightly puzzled.
But you can't put
face.
a thumbs down, can you? I don't think you can do a dislike. Is that? I'm pretty sure you can't.
No.
Oh no, you can do angry face.
Yeah,
we get this
angry. But that's more like I'm angry at this injustice or something. You can't actually say I dislike what you've just said. Like you can on YouTube, though, can't you?
Yeah,
I've had
you have to be very
angry at things that I've said in a kind of like, I disagree with you.
You could choose to interpret it as, oh, that's righteous anger for
Andy
my
does
cause.
it all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, and of course, if there was I've always thought that Facebook, with apologies to American listeners, does show its American roots, because if there was a British version of Facebook, there'd just be the kind of meh face, because as Brits we like to do this. Non-committal. There should be a non-committal face.
Yeah.
I'm not happy. I'm not sad. I'm just
That's right.
Just before we move on to a different aspect on this kind of topic of distraction, before we get distracted from distraction, it is helpful, Aaron, talking about having a dumb phone and, rather than a smartphone. And I've often kind of thought, I'd love to be able to do that. But then, I think for me, the thing that keeps my smartphone going is the thought of turning up in a foreign country and not having Google Maps. It's the fear of losing that probably more than the access to Facebook. But I guess a couple of things I found really interesting on that was a couple of years ago, after I'd read The Shallows and it had a kind of profound impact upon me, one of the things I thought about was I came to the decision I wasn't going to quit social media, but I was going to make a decision for at least a month that I'd only be able to access Twitter and Facebook once a day. So I would pick a time, I would go on it once a day, do anything, reply to stuff, post stuff. What I found was really interesting is actually, because I was only going on once a day, my desire to look at it then diminished, because the whole point of social media is to kind of draw you in and to keep kind of going back and back. And so actually by only allowing myself to go once a day, it suddenly kind of cut off that desire I had to keep checking. And that was very interesting. The other time was a couple of years ago, I was in New Zealand and I was on a paddleboard trip down a river for 5 days outside of all kind of connectivity. There was no roads, no phone reception or anything. And to be honest, probably since the age of 18, that was the longest period of time that I've had outside of like connectivity with any kind of the outside world. And the first day I was having massive withdrawal symptoms. I was thinking, how am I going to cope? Like, I'm on my own, no connection. But I tell you what, after 4 days, I was absolutely loving it. I was in a place that I hadn't been in. Like, I had, you have that kind of funny kind of like, I've got this kind of memory, like deja vu kind of feeling. And it was basically the feeling of like when I was like a teenager and you go away from home for a week and you just like had no idea what happened at home because like you didn't have a phone. And on the journey back, I was on the bus and the bus driver said, "Oh, you'll get phone reception when we get over this hill if you want to check your phone." And I thought to myself, like, I don't want to. Like, I'm so happy in this moment of like complete disconnection from the world. I've had time to process and think and read and reflect in a way that I just haven't for over a decade, which is really quite profound. But
it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
I remember having a similar experience on a fishing trip in Canada a few years ago. Exactly the same thing as you described. It's almost exactly the same, Michael. The first day of 5 days without internet or Wi-Fi, almost feeling like I was like missing like an arm. And then by the end of it, like it's beautiful. This does, by the way, we don't need to pursue this because we've only got so much time and so much to talk about. As you talked there, one of the things that I think social media usage does raise for us to think about is time and how we divide our time up. Because we all say we're busy, but we find time to go on this stuff. And I think it was John Piper of all people, somebody like him at that end of the sort of conservative spectrum, Christian spectrum, once said, he thought one of the reasons why that God had allowed the creation of social media was so the day of judgment, when the Lord says, "Why did you not spend more time reading the Bible and praying?" none of us would have any excuse because of going, well, let's just talk, my son, my daughter, about your social media usage. You say you were too busy, but you spent 3.5 hours on the thing every day. So,
and I guess that's where sobering. The iPhone is quite helpful in that once a week you get a thing that says like, how many hours have I spent on this? Like, and you can break it down. And
that is terrifying, actually, isn't it? When you break it down and you see where the time has gone.
Absolutely. There's so much more we could say about distraction, but we probably should move on. Because I guess one of the other areas that would be good to think about would be the kind of world that kind of social media invites us into. So there's been a lot of talk about being brought into kind of echo chambers of our own making, and that, the way that not only we choose, but particularly the algorithms of social media work will be to kind of expose us to stuff that we would particularly like, and be interested in, and probably kind of protect us from or alienate us from stuff that we don't. This was brought home to me a while back. I was someone had tweeted in response to an opinion poll before the last general election here in the UK, and they were flabbergasted that the Conservative Party had been given a lead in one of the polls, and they said, "How can the Conservative Party be in the lead? I don't know any bleep Tories." And I kind of thought, well, that's the point, isn't it? Like, this person lives in this kind of social media bubble where they've literally got no interaction with anyone who votes Conservative. And yet, clearly, there are people in the country who do vote Conservative. They're just not people that will ever invade that person's kind of sphere of influence. But they had therefore interpreted their bubble as the world, or at least the UK.
Yeah.
And so they were in this kind of this dissonance between like this opinion poll and what they were seeing reflected on their social media feed. So I guess what are some of the dangers inherent in that for us and for people in general?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. It totally makes sense. As you say, the echo chamber issue. Think of Brexit and Trump as well, as surprise political sort of outcomes that people just were like, "What? That's not allowed to happen." Well, it did happen. So it's sort of like, but it does show the shock and outrage of it. Does show exactly what you're saying. That we sort of surround ourselves with, I guess, the people that are perhaps more like us. And even if we do have a variety of friends, I'm sure many people do have a variety of friends across the spectrum on their sort of social, religious, or political views. I think Facebook does tend to work on an interactive basis, doesn't it? So you obviously, Facebook as an example, you tend to see the things of the people that you have interacted with, and they see the things you've got. So it's amazing, really, how people still post things without realizing that, I think. And they might be offended, let's say, when someone doesn't like this or that as much as something else, but it's often algorithm based, and it's, you might have 1,000 friends, but then you sort of think sometimes, I still forget, you sort of post something, you almost think, oh, this will appear in 1,000 people's news feeds. Well, of course it won't. There's a lot of things to go in the news feed, and the algorithm will decide. The algorithm gods will decide based on various complicated factors, which might relate to all sorts of things. It might be how much you've corresponded with that person recently. It might be whether they liked something you did previously. So it's unbelievable how much power there is in stuff we talked about earlier, like the likes and like the comments and things like that. And yet many people engage who are users, as you say, amusingly, like drug users, are users of it without realizing the kind of ramifications of every action that they're doing on there, and therefore how things you're saying are being received and perceived and all the rest of it, which really does have a big impact when we're thinking about how powerful social media is at shaping opinion. It's actually one of the reasons why I'm trying to challenge myself to post more. I don't think I've actually been consistent in that, but because I have to go online to do these things, it's not a natural thing for me just to post whatever I'm doing in life, whatever. So occasionally we'll do a post, but not very often. And I want to have an awe in there more, because for me, it's more of a missional action. I've got to make a decision. Okay, I'm going to go on social media because I'm not connected to it in a vast way in the rest of my life. But opinion is shaped there in really profound ways. And I think we can't just ignore it and say, let's completely disconnect, as it were. It's almost the other side of the coin.
Yeah, I think a couple of thoughts in response to that too is, I think we were saying before we started recording the show, there was a great phrase I came across. I think it was in Wired magazine or somewhere a few years ago, about a computer scientist and sociologist in the States who'd coined the term digital flocking to describe this tendency we have to kind of gather together with like-minded folks. And in fact, digital media has allowed that in a way it was never possible. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you were a gay, left-wing, disabled Star Trek fan, to find other people like you would have been very tough. But now there'll be a Facebook group for you and a Google Hangouts for you, and all those kind of sort of things where you can flock together. And the danger is, as you say, you don't listen to others. Now, it's easy to point the finger outside the world. One of my fears is this goes on in the church, that it's very, very, very easy to just surround yourself with a Christian echo chamber. And this has been brought home to me in just recent while, because I've just got a new book out. Every author has to plug his
Dude, I had no idea.
wouldn't know that from social media, would you?
I've only seen 17 posts about it in the last
I know,
2 hours.
Exactly. It's ridiculous. So I've got this book out called Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? And it's been great fun, enjoyed writing it and all. But one of the things that's actually begun to disturb me slightly is in the last kind of week or so, increasing numbers of Christians, well, they'll see that this is Christians, not non-Christians. I mean, I expect non-Christians to get cross at it, but it's Christians seeing it and post on social media under it going, well, the answer's no, or just no in capitals, exclamation mark, or why do we need a whole book to give a one-word answer? And, and it disturbs me slightly because, of course, the answers to those things are firstly, well, Christians think the answer is no, but our secular friends don't, and our Muslim friends don't. So somebody who said this has probably never actually occurred to them that actually there might be people out there who don't believe as we do. Yeah. And then even those who are aware there's a world outside the church, I've pushed back on some folks going, but does it not occur to you that if you say the answer is no, there's a follow-up question, which is, well, why is the answer no? And the fact we need to engage with those outside the church. And so I do worry that, for Christians, it's very, very easy to fill your social media feed up with all of your favorite Christian, channels and everything else and not listen. And so, I suppose the challenge, and I want to make sure we're not just standing here being holier than thou, because we're guilty of this too, is how do we make sure, as you say, that we're engaging with the world, that we're listening to others, we're getting other perspectives, we're learning what our non-Christian friends are talking about. We know that how to communicate well. And also within the Christian world too, of course, we don't even bubble ourselves within that. Because, of course, if you're a sort of, charismatic or a Pentecostal, it's easy to just hang out with those folks and not hang out with those who are different and are followers of Christ, but might take a different perspective on certain issues.
If we're charismatic, we just hang out with the Holy Spirit, Andy.
Absolutely. What I would say, though, I think for me, Aaron, and I it's a daily struggle to get this right, is what I've tried to do is be intentional so that you don't hit the distraction thing. So when I watched The Social Dilemma, that was a profoundly challenging documentary. And one of my actions was, and maybe I do need to go further, but one of my immediate actions was what I did is I've got a smartphone because I'm a bit of an Apple, aficionado. So, I remember queuing for the first iPhone and getting very excited when I got this thing. But what I did after that documentary is I've taken the Facebook app off my phone. I've taken the Twitter app off my phone. So it makes it harder to engage those things. So you have to be more intentional. And when I play with the kids, the phone is in a different room. And we have just last weekend, so we're still new to this stuff. My wife and I have got this new thing we're doing where on Sundays we do a digital Sabbath. So the phones go off, they go in a plastic box in the kitchen. And the rule is if you need to, if you've got we call the grandparents on a Sunday, that's okay. You can turn the phone on to do a voice call. Or if there's an emergency, like for the navigation thing you mentioned, Michael, if we go on a road trip, the phone will go in the trunk of the car, the boot of the car. So it's there if we need it, but it's turned off. And again, trying to come out of that user mentality. How do we stop being users? Or how do we go back to being users and not being used, I suppose?
Yeah.
It's tough.
Yeah,
it's tough.
I
guess lots to think about.
Sorry, is Michael jumping?
No, I was just going to say, Michael. I guess, and this has been the challenge for all of us, I guess, globally over the last year, has been we've been forced in a way to interact on social media because that's been the only legalized kind of form of community. Normally we would be meeting physically with people, we'd have church communities where we'd meet physically and so on. So I think all of these challenges have been exacerbated, which is why it's really good to talk about and reflect on, and think about what that's doing for us. I mean, I guess one of the things that the church, like as in a physical gathering of the church, not kind of online, kind of YouTube or Facebook or whatever, like a church should do, is it brings us into contact with Christians who are not like us. They're different, they have different interests, they have different age group, they're from a different kind of part of society and so on. And there's something profoundly enriching about that. Whereas, like you say, even as Christians, we can kind of seek out kind of similar Christian community when we're online, and kind of the danger of just kind of that reinforcing of our views. And I guess I'll just think about it evangelistically as well. One of the things I think that's a challenge about doing, we often think it's great to be able to do evangelism online. People can watch and listen to stuff. But as someone said, we generally search out online on social media stuff that we will find will reinforce ideas that we already have. And I know that, I'm scrolling through Twitter
Yeah.
and I'll be immediately drawn to click on links of stuff that will probably reinforce an idea that I've already got. And I'll be less disposed to clicking on a link that's going to challenge a view that I've already got, because I don't want to be challenged like that. And of course, if we're trying to change people's minds, which is kind of what repentance is all about, that's profoundly difficult when people are predisposed to not wanting to do that, particularly in that environment. Sorry, I was cutting you off, Aaron. You were about to say something else.
No, it's fine. No, but just I was just respond to what Andy was saying, but I'll just jump on what you said there. It's funny that you say that we search things out that would help us, but again, it comes back to the algorithms. YouTube, for example, searches you out almost and gives you the things on a platter, the things that you would like. And so it's quite a convenient thing. It's kind of, this is nice. That's a video I would like. Yes, well done, YouTube. You've done well, but it's doing it based on your own data, based on the things that you've actually liked and seen previously. So we get used to that. And because of the convenience, I think we don't challenge the fact that it's, there are problems out the other side of that as well. I think I was going to say on your thing, Andy, as well, Steve Jobs famously, of course, a well-known quote now, isn't it, that he didn't want his own children to use the iPhone or iPad. And that should tell you a lot, shouldn't it, about the way in which malformation can happen through some of these. And I know so many parents that can't get their children off of tablets and devices. And so this is like, if I didn't give them this, they would go crazy. And I just think, wow, we just never had that as a kind of an option. I guess we do occasionally, they might get to things, but we're always with them. And it's very, very occasional. They never ever get to, just go on their own on a tablet. And I think that's a really important thing. But so many parents, it's like, this is the only thing that will help it, but only because you've basically trained their brain. You're starting to train their brain to kind of get their kind of dopamine fix from a certain kind of stimuli. And because you train them in that way, of course they're going to find it difficult to transition away from it. So I think there does need some radical action, like you say, Andy. What you said, deleting the Twitter app from your phone and things like that. Those kinds of actions are increasingly necessary, or at least on some way, to show that you're alive, to show that you're fighting, you're able to resist, so you're able to make a choice. You can't just say you can't make a choice if you're not able to resist. So I think scaling back and saying, I'll just go on a fast for a time, as you say, for a day or a week or whatever. And then when you come back into it, you'll come into it with a better frame of mind. You'll be making choices rather than having it all made for you by the environment.
I think that's an interesting thing on the parenting, right? Because similar to you, we've made similar choices as parents. We wanted our kids to enjoy some of the digital stuff, but also be very careful. So yeah, I mean, obviously as they're young, they're 8 and 6, but we've already committed. They don't play computer games. They don't have tablets. They don't have access to any of those things. They've never once wanted it, actually, which is interesting. And when we watch stuff, we haven't got a TV as well, which is also something I hugely commend, and recommend to others. That was recommended to us.
Wow.
And it's amazing,
that's a
actually.
John Piper thing, isn't it? He doesn't have a
Well,
TV.
see what happens. Here's an interesting thing. When people discover that you haven't got one, they firstly think you're a hermit, and to go, no, a hermit. We watch stuff. We have Netflix and iTunes, Amazon Prime, but we open up the laptop and do that. But what that means is that our lounge isn't dominated in the corner by the large black box. It occurred to me, like in the ancient world, you'd go into the common living area of, say, a Roman or Greek home, and there in the corner would be the household gods, and they would have centre place. I visit houses in the East, and it's the same in Hindu culture. And I remember coming back to the West and going, Struth, we've just done the same thing because we've created a little household shrine with a TV. Everything's focused that way, and so that decision. And then, as I say, just thinking very seriously about that. And then I suddenly realised, actually, this advice is coming up everywhere. So the social dilemma, if for listeners, if they haven't watched that documentary, it's worth doing, because right at the end, there's a psychologist called Jonathan Haidt who's written a lot on sort of the mind and thinking and culture. I wrote quite an influential book called The Coddling of the American Mind. Yeah. And he said, number one rule as a psychologist, he would say, do not let anybody, don't let your kids under the age of 16, ideally under 18, have access to a smartphone, because the damage it does. And then I recently read Abigail Schreier's book on the transgender craze, Irreversible Damage, amazing book. And at the end of that, her top 10 tips for parents, particularly parents of daughters and all that's going on around the transgender stuff right now. Her number one tip, do not let your kids have a smartphone. Yeah. The research that's been done linking it to the social contagion stuff around transgender. Before that, it was the self-harm and the suicide stuff, I think is hugely important. So I think ask yourself, what choices can I make? Don't be a hermit.
Yeah.
Use the good stuff that's out there, but again, try and shift the narrative so that you're in the driving seat. And the great thing is, obviously our kids are young, but we have not had our kids come in and go, hey, it's not fair, our kids do this. My kids spend half their time in the back garden, and it's Scotland, I tell you, the weather's not good. But they're out there doing crazy stuff. And it means we have to live with interesting science experiments and, an attempt to dig a tunnel to Australia in the vegetable garden and stuff. And I'm like, you know what? It's worth it for the fact they're engaging in the real world and not just in the faux digital one.
It'll save you for airfare as well, of course, if you to get to Australia via a tunnel.
It will.
I was just realising that I grew up without a TV, and the one thing that I remember doing was digging a hole in the backyard and trying to get to Australia. So maybe it's the thing that happens when you don't have a television. The first thing you do is you try and dig to Australia.
That's amazing.
Seriously, looking back, I mean, actually, I look back at my childhood, and there was a kind of slight kind of mockery that you get at school when you were people would realise you didn't have a TV. But actually, I'm not at all upset that looking back at my childhood I didn't. And I think the added creativity and stuff that we did, probably because we weren't using our time on that. So I think there can be this feeling of we're denying our children something good, but actually are we actually not only protecting them but through that helping them to discover other things that are going to be a lot more productive, formative and wholesome in the long run.
There's such a fear. There's a real fear about it, isn't there? There's a fear about their social disconnectedness if they're not connected to all this media, if they're not playing the latest games. You just think, what the heck are you talking about? You should be scared of the other side of this. You should not be scared that their friends at school are going to say, oh, why aren't you playing Fallout or whatever? You should be scared about what's actually happening to them being malformed by the media. And you are, as parents, you're in control of it. You've been given authority over your children to raise them up. It's a huge sacred responsibility. And I just think so few parents are aware of the ways in which they're basically outsourcing a lot of parental authority to other platforms. It's quite scary, really. That's the thing I'm more scared of than my children not being able to partake in a conversation about Minecraft or something.
Yeah. Well, I think, I know we're kind of running out of time, but just a sudden thought there before, Michael, I know you've got the sense you wanted to raise one last question or something, is, I think a couple of things very quickly there, Aaron, that I think we've realised. One is, I think, for folks listening to this who have that worry about your kids and so forth, I think there's a couple of things going on. One is that kids, if you encourage them to be social and outgoing, they'll always be social and outgoing. So our kids have got lots of friends. They play with the neighbourhood kids, friends. Like my son, he knows about Minecraft. His friends are into it, but he also knows we don't have that game. We're not going to play, and it hasn't been an issue at all, which is interesting. So if you encourage them to be outgoing and friendly, and actually, what's interesting is because a lot of our neighbourhood families spend huge amounts of time on screens. Our kids have become quite popular because we, rather than put some high definition TV in, we paid to put. We got a trampoline and a swing set and a jungle gym thing in the back garden. We put money in that, and all the local kids come around and play there actually, which is hilarious, which is funny. So they've become a bit of a social attraction. And then the other thing I think as well that could wrong foot parents is if we're not careful, we assume that media today is like it was when we were kids.
Yeah.
And to go, it is a different ballpark entirely. I grew up, I'm 40, so I grew up at an age of 3 or 4 channels, and media was quite a different animal. And it's easy to assume, we don't need to worry, it's neutral. Because I think when it began, there was more neutrality to it. I think now it isn't really.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Aaron, do you want to come back on that?
Well, just I think as Andy's saying, I think we do make that mistake regularly in terms of thinking we turned out okay, but if you're if you remember the day when the internet came out and you had to dial up and hear the kind of crazy screeching sound and things, and only one person at a time, and be on MSN Messenger, you remember a time because you were brought up pre-generation Z, as it were. We're not digital natives, and so there's a reason why we're able to take a different sort of approach. And I do think it's a totally different ball game for younger generations, and parents who are not digital natives need to, they need to be aware of the ways in which those things can malform, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess as we try and kind of wrap these kind of things up, there's loads more we could talk about in terms of dangers and distractions. And, in a sense, we're not unique in talking about that. Social Dilemma's doing that. The Shallows did that 10 years ago and so on. But thinking particularly as Christians and responding to the problems that we see, I guess one of the questions is, how does the gospel help us as we respond to this? Because it'd be very easy just to say, oh, it's terrible, it's bad. But actually, Christians have always had to adapt to new forms of technology, whether it was the printing press or whatever it was, and think about how do we use this, but how do we respond in a Christian way to it? So I guess what are some of the resources that the gospel gives us that helps us to engage well in this arena, rather than being sucked in? Like, what are some of the unique things that we have as Christians that could really help us?
A couple of thoughts here. Then Aaron's the theologian, so we'll probably have much more wisdom to offer than me. But a couple of thoughts very, very quickly, Michael. The first is, of course, because as Christians we believe that humankind is both made in the image of God, but also fallen. That should help us approach anything that human beings make and engage in with that twofold framework. And so that means we can approach digital technology and go, hey, it's amazing. Human beings are technology makers. We see it on the early pages of Genesis, right in the beginning, human beings go out and make stuff.
Yeah.
But all the things that we make reflect that both, imago Dei, image of God, and fallenness thing. So I think, with technology, it's so easy to get sucked in because it looks amazing and it's glitzy and it's glamorous. Always be asking those two questions. What here reflects, all that is good about humanity? God declared of humans, we're very, very good, but we're also fallen. And then what reflects the fallenness? And to be asking that. Don't get sucked in. Don't condemn and just go, it's all rubbish. But equally, don't just get dragged along with it's all wonderful. So I think that's something I think the gospel offers, is that place to stand and judge from outside. Then I think the other thing as well the gospel offers is reminding us that perhaps the key question is, what does it mean to be human? I think so much for me comes down to that. Whose image are we made in? Whose image are we being conformed to? And I think that is a thing that Christians need to be prepared to fight for, because we haven't got time to explore this in huge detail. But one of my sort of bigger concerns, I guess, about digital technology in general is it sort of leads us towards a kind of a new Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was that ancient heresy that said the only thing that matters is the mind and the spirit. The material world is bad. And I think social media technology pushes us that way, and if it can't be reproduced digitally, it doesn't matter. Technology can be, communication is just a stream of information. Church services can just go online, and we forget this physical world. And I think the gospel reminds us, no, we need to fight for the physical world, because God made a world of stuff. When Jesus came, he didn't come as some idea just beamed into everyone's minds. He came in flesh and blood. He also cared about the small and the particular. God could have appeared simultaneously in every culture around the world all at one time. He could have done that, but he didn't. He chose to come in one particular form, in one particular place. And again, that should encourage us as Christians to, it's exciting that social media, you could reach lots of people at once. But also maybe God might be interested in us just reaching our next door neighbor and not worrying about how many likes or retweets we've got. And so I think, think about that. What does it mean to be human? Think about the good and the bad. And then, as I say, the other place I often go in this is that passage in Romans where it says, be transformed by the renewing of your minds. We're called to be a transformed people, not by our own power, but by the power of the gospel, by the power of God's Spirit. And if we're not transformed into his image, we'll be transformed into something else. And so again, as we use media, as we reach out, whether it's social media or more old school media, just constantly be asking, what is this trying to transform me into? If the thing I'm watching is helpful and it helps me reflect more of the image of Christ, or to engage more with those who are lost, who need to know that message, fantastic. But if it's dragging me away from that, if it's making me shallow and harsh and tribal and judgmental and other things that social media can encourage, maybe that's the point to turn the phone off and go, no, I'm going to say no to that. So let Christ be the criterion.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's very theological as well. And I don't need to really jump in on it, but I feel like always. It's interesting.
The apologist has become a theologian.
Exactly. Look at that.
Yeah. And theologians as the fifth wheel, right? You're the fifth wheel on the vehicle.
That's it.
See, but
Exactly. I'll jump in on a few of them just because it's so interesting to think of, the ways in which we've been quite we need to be. We've been quite tough on technology in this discussion, haven't we? We've been sort of talking about the dangers of things and the awareness of that. I think that's that's the headline thing that I think we need to take away, to think, okay, in what ways do we need to make some of these choices and reflect on a sort of ascetic approach, which is sort of withdrawing from some of these things, so that we can almost clear and get perspective. But I do think we also need to think of the ways, as I've said previously, missionally, that we're called to sort of take dominion over technology as well. As Andy said, technology is a human thing. It's a thing that we've been doing. You see it in Genesis from the very beginning. I read an interesting book by Doug Wilson recently called Productivity, which has an interesting chapter on technology, where he's saying we cannot just be the sort of agrarian ideal types that just withdraw and go, right, technology is evil, we must move away from it. We have to find a way of taking dominion as Christians, actually, in the world. And I'm reminded of Matthew 28, go into all the world, and make disciples of many nations. And you think, how are you going to do it? The gospel goes everywhere, not just locationally in terms of geographical, but actually it does mean the social media world. You can't just go, that's rubbish, we don't like it, we're going to stay out of it. We have to find a way to withdraw in order to go back in again. I think there's that important dynamic. If you're immersed, you can't really get perspective to actually be on mission going in. But if you withdraw and you've got perspective, okay, what is the gospel for? Well, it's for the world. I need to go into the world, save the world. So we don't love the world, but at the same time, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. And so with that message, we do need to sort of be aware of going into these platforms with a missional mindset, not just a sort of dead being carried along by the stream, a kind of piece of flotsam and jetsam, whatever. One final thing would just be the sort of, we talked about the connectivity, the yearning for friendship, talk about what it means to be a friend and how we've changed the meaning of that. And obviously, the gospel gives you the greatest possible notion of friendship, and that you can be friends with God. And we don't often think about being friends with God, that God actually wants fellowship with us. He loves us and wants to actually fellowship and commune with us. I don't think we think about that enough as Christians. We think about, I've got this message about God that I need to tell others. I go to church and have my experiences at church, but we have fellowship with God. And I don't think we tap into that enough, plug in to that enough in our sort of Christian lives. And obviously that fellowship with God then transports us into fellowship with one another in the church. And that's why the church is should be such a radical community, because people should look at the church and go, whoa, I thought I had friends. You guys seem to have like friendship on a different level. And it's like, well, yeah, because we have the Holy Spirit.
There's so much that's really helpful there. I guess my only thing I was going to add on that was just, I think there's a sense in which, like, so much of our use of social media can often be seeking approval. I mean, the whole like button thing we talked about earlier is part of that, isn't it? We want to be noticed. We want to be liked, approved of. And, psychologists and scientists have talked about how it gives you a dopamine hit, when everyone likes your stuff, likes okay. If they comment, it's even better. We want that, we crave that. But obviously, there is that sense, a bit like a drug addict. The more you have it, the more you need to kind of give you that same level of hit. And ultimately, of course, it's profoundly dissatisfying because you put out a post that gets like 1,000 likes and all sorts of comments, but what have you actually achieved? When you look back at it, when you hit the hay at the end of the day, you look back and think, well, what have I actually done through that? Was that something really to feel happy about? And I guess for me, one of the things that I find really helpful is just to go back and say, well, whose approval am I really after? And as a Christian, obviously, my approval, or at least it should be, that I'm desiring the approval of God. And that's a challenge, but it's also an incredible privilege, isn't it? It's a challenge because it makes me think, well, is that the case? At the end of the day, do I care about what God thinks of me and what I do more than what my social media followers do? But it's also an amazing privilege because it's the God of the universe can be pleased in his creatures. The fact that I can bring pleasure to the heart of God through the things that I do or say is a profound thought. I think sometimes we kind of just feel that God at best tolerates us. He's like a kind of slightly dissatisfied headmaster who's kind of there, kind of looking on, thinking, well, could have done better. But that sense in which actually God can be delighted. He's not just liking us, but he loves us. He delights in us. and we can bring pleasure to the heart of God. And in a sense, that frees us and it liberates us in our use of social media, because then actually the most interesting people often on social media and the internet in general are not those who are out to be liked. There are those, and that's true in life, isn't it? It's people who are set free from the desire to be liked and for wanting to kind of pander to people's approval, who can actually say stuff that's hopefully interesting and engaging and creative. So hopefully we'll be better social media users if actually our use of social media is not primarily driven by how popular we'll become and how many people are going to like us at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's so
guys.
true.
Thank you so much.
I know we're criminally over time. I was just going to say one tiny thing about Jesus on that. Can I? It is about Jesus.
We can talk
just
about
thinking
Jesus.
What you said there.
Allow you.
It just strikes me as you were saying there. Jesus is the epitome of someone who doesn't need affirmation from anyone else. He's got it from his Father, and we see that explicitly in the Gospels. And Jesus was such a magnetic figure. Everyone wants to everyone likes Jesus. Actually, even the great atheist philosophers of the 19th century, the likes of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, who wrote vociferously against Christianity, they often would say Christianity was, we don't like Christianity, but we like Jesus, or there's something about Jesus that was compelling. And he's the epitome of someone who's got his affirmation elsewhere. And I think that's something we need to model, get our affirmation from God.
That's brilliant. Yeah, fantastic. Guys, thank you so much. There's so much more we could talk about. I think we've got enough here to kind of fill about 3 episodes, but I hope that's been helpful. And I've certainly enjoyed discussing these things. So do let us know your thoughts and feedback on that. But we'll be back next week for another episode. And we look forward to, I was going to say look forward to seeing you then, but we're not going to see you, and more to the point, you're not going to see us, which is a pleasure, I'm sure, for you. But thanks for being with us, and see you again.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.